the Dia de los Muertos. One of the traditions is that you honor the deceased using Calaveras and Aztec marigold flowers. They call this, I don't know if I can pronounce this correctly, but Simpazuchitl. And, build home altars and that sort of thing. So Calaveras are actually a part of Dia de los Muertos and relevant to our conversation.
Is that like the candy skulls? Because I used to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I always enjoyed that. Creepy though it may appear.
I'm going to eat your skull.
Yeah, but some of them are pretty disgusting. Some people knew how to make the skulls where they were actually edible, and some of them are like, eating candy corn, which is not one of my favorite Halloween candies. This time on the Plutopia podcast, Jon and Scoop do a deep dive, 6 feet deep, into death, Halloween, sex and death, and pagan celebrations as people celebrate Dia de los Muertos, or the Day of the Dead. Sadly, George Romero will not be making a posthumous cameo appearance.
Welcome to yet another episode of the Plutopia podcast. Today's guests are Scoop Sweeney and John Lebkowski, the Plutopians. And we're going to talk about a subject that people tend not to probably talk about enough. We're going to talk about death.
And it's a touchy subject, especially around Halloween, when there's so many people imitating the victims of various deaths. You'll see your zombies and your vampires, and that's all fun and games. But when the real thing happens, people don't like to talk about it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Halloween is originally based on All Saints' Day. And I guess there are like pagan elements that feed into it as well. But the connection with death is less clear there than it is on like November 1st, which is Dia de los Muertos.
Mm-hmm.
And Dia de los Muertos is kind of an acknowledgement and celebration of death. We so often try not to think about it. And we really, generally people don't believe they're going to die. I mean, they kind of know they're going to die, but really they don't think so. But in Dia de los Muertos, you kind of say, well, yep, a lot of people died. We'll probably die too. So then they honor the deceased, and they also recognize that death is an inherent part of life, and that impermanence is an inherent part of the universe. And that everything is always changing and moving. And what seems permanent isn't really permanent. It just has a lower rate of change.
Well,
change is inevitable.
Yeah, people have a different view of how to deal with death depending on their background. A lot of cultures have a totally different way of dealing with death. And, I've been reading about my Choctaw heritage, and I found some interesting stuff about how the Choctaw handled the dead and dealt with the death of a family member or a member of the tribe, and pretty weird stuff. But in reading how it evolved, the original way they were handling the dead body of the person in their family was to build a structure out in front of their house, and the body would lay there for 3, 4, 5 days, and in some cases for actual months, until the local wildlife had picked it clean. And what was left, they had members of the tribe who were called bone pickers. And they actually grew their fingernails on the thumb, the forefinger, and the middle finger long to where they could pick the meat off the bones. And that is, when I read that, I'm like, well, I don't remember any of my family doing that. But that morphed into a more modern treatment of death and of funeral processes. It's a little less dire, but different cultures handle it differently. My own family, whenever someone died, I enjoyed going to the funerals because there was always a big wake and people would bring food. And that was a part of the Choctaw experience for sure, because whenever any of my mother's family passed away, there were just it was feasting. You had the body right there in the at the funeral home, and everyone would stand around and talk about the person and laugh and tell jokes and drink and eat a lot. And other cultures that I've experienced, gone to funerals that were just horrifying. I mean, everyone was just bummed out and weeping and wailing and just not having a good time. But other cultures seem to make it into a party celebrating the departed.
Yeah, the Tibetans have what they call sky burial.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very similar to what you're talking about. They put the corpse on a mountaintop to decompose and either be exposed to the elements or eaten by scavenging animals. And, this is like a type of excarnation, which is the opposite of incarnation, or I guess. And I think this is mostly in Tibet, also in like Mongolia, Sichuan, places like that. And it's associated, I think, with the Vajrayana Buddhist traditions there. And, another thing, Buddhist thing, is I went to a Buddhist service. I don't know whether we were referring to it as a funeral, but a friend of mine who was a Buddhist had died. And when I showed up, his body was there, kind of laying in the middle of the room, and there had been no intervention by an undertaker or anything like that. He was actually a little bit contorted. You could see a little bit of his death agony in the way that he was, but they just put him there as he was when he died. People sat, and a big part of the service was people telling stories about their experiences with the guy, which is, of course, pretty traditional. You do that away. You often do that at a funeral.
Mm-hmm.
And it's partly a way for people to just remember the person and revisit that person in their memory before they're laid to rest, however that might be, on the side of the mountain or in a coffin. That's the idea of being put in a coffin and buried 6 feet underground. Really just terrifies me. I'm so claustrophobic. I can't really imagine doing that. And I'm looking for, and I have found a little bit about natural burials. Mm-hmm. That you certainly can't do a sky burial or the kind of Choctaw burial you were referring to.
Yeah, that was ruled out a long time ago.
But there are some places that do natural burials. There's one thing I was aware of, and I don't know whether this actually exists or was just something that somebody was considering. But the idea was that you put the body in a sort of container that's put at the root of a tree, mm-hmm. and that the body sort of feeds into the tree.
I plan on being cremated, so does Clarissa. And it's no big deal. Her brother passed away in 2015, and he was cremated, had no service. He didn't want to, be mourned or anything. And they took his ashes out to his favorite place, which was Yosemite, and spread it there. And I know a lot of people who've done similar things. They just wanted to be, scattered, either on the ocean or in a favorite lake or in a park, or even in their backyard. I knew one guy had his wife just take things out when he was gone and scatter it in his garden. So
wow.
I, I didn't eat any more of their food though when they served from the garden after that. But that's a whole, hang up that doesn't isn't really based on anything real, But it sometimes, me included, will get creeped out about thinking about death. But when you look at it logically, it's just part of the. We couldn't have life without death, really.
I mean, I think in earlier times, a person when they were dying would be dying in the home, and people would be having an extended experience of the dying process. But we kind of hide it now.
Yeah.
And when we do have a death that's close to us, our grief is amplified by the unfamiliarity of that experience.
Mm-hmm.
Because we really don't spend much time around death. And when we are sort of in the presence of the dead or a death, it's jarring. It doesn't feel like a natural thing, but it is. I mean,
yeah,
it's an inherent thing.
It used to be common practice for the family to have the body in the casket or whatever on display at the home, in the living room. Everybody would come over. It was only when the funeral homes became a big deal and they started, providing all the, exhibition space, if you will, for the deceased that went away. But that used to be a big deal. When someone passed away, you went over to the house and said goodbye to the body, and then went in. There would always be food and drink and whatever, and it was much more family-oriented thing than the process. The funeral industry kind of creeps me out.
Yeah,
just the experience of dealing with it. I mean, to begin with, the expense of dying is way more expensive to die than it is to be born these days.
There's a quote from Sallie Tisdale that I picked up from the latest issue of Lion's Roar magazine. And the quote is, "Everyone is a beginner when it comes to death." And, that's really accurate. You don't die but once. And you don't have any conversation with people who have died who can tell you what it's like. Well, actually, I say that. That's not necessarily true. There are people who have died in a sense. They died on the operating table and were revived,
Mm-hmm.
had end of death experiences. And the accounts from those experiences are pretty interesting, actually.
Yeah, I've read some of those, and it's medical professionals have all said, well, no, it's just a hallucination. They're not really dead, and it's like, well.
Well, they are actually dead.
They were clinically dead, but
clinically dead. Yeah.
I guess perhaps the brain remains in operation for a while, even after the heart has stopped. But
yeah, I can read one of those. I mentioned that issue of Lion's Roar. There's also an account by a Buddhist named Yongey Mingyu Rinpoche, and he. I can read just a little bit of this. He says, I saw different colors, and then slowly I could not hear or see. The elements of the body were dissolving. I lost touch with my physical body altogether. Then I had a wonderful experience. There was no thought, no emotion, no concept. Mind was clear and wakeful, like a blue sky with the sun shining, transparent and all pervasive. There was no inside and outside, no subject, an object, no sense of body, no ordinary senses. At the same time, mind was pervasive, knowing, and very clear. I knew what was going on, but it was not like a normal experience. Difficult to describe, cannot really be put into words. And then, eventually he sort of came back.
mm-hmm.
But descriptions are like that. I have a friend, actually someone that is going to be a guest on our Plutopia live stream next week, Jamie Ellerby, who is an e-patient par excellence and has a very complex set of medical issues. And he will probably talk about this when we talk to him. He had what they refer to as a near-death experience, and he said that there was no pain, and he was in a place where he really felt it was kind of a wonderful thing. And then they brought him back, and he was actually upset that they brought him back.
Yeah,
And he says
that's
that
a
he always
common
has his
occurrence.
NDR close by now.
Yeah, it's a common occurrence from
DNR.
the ones I've read where the people were revived and were really pissed at the doctor and the medical staff who did it. It's like, I didn't want you to do that. It's like, okay, sorry, we'll kill you again.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's kind of hard to get them to do. I know
Yeah.
that we went through that with my mother, who had been revived, but she didn't really intend to be revived. And we went through a whole process of deciding whether to. I mean, she had a DNR,
Yeah.
but she had been resuscitated, and we went through a process of figuring out what to do about that. About take her off the ventilator or not, and that's a terrible thing to go through.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate. I can't imagine the emotions you guys had to go through. That, yeah, having a DNR is a very important thing if you're, convinced that there is no good reason to bring the person back if they're, suffering and are having an incurable condition. A DNR.
Well, it's important if you have a DNR to discuss that thoroughly with anyone that you may assign medical power of attorney. Mm-hmm. Because if the person with medical power of attorney isn't aware of the DNR, or they just lose track or whatever, they may ignore it and they can override it.
Yeah, well, when my dad passed away, I was really impressed with the way he handled it, because he knew there was no way that he was going to survive. He had liver cancer. He went into the doctor, and the doctor said, well, we could do chemotherapy and radiation. And my dad, in his logical businessman way, said, how much will that buy me? He said, 6 months, maybe 3 months. We just don't know. He said, so I'm going to go through all that nightmare of chemotherapy and radiation, and it's going to buy me a few months. He said, I don't think so. So he just called all of us in the family and said, why don't you come visit, stay for a while, because I'm checking out. And he was very, he handled it so well. I mean, a lot of the family were all freaked out until they saw that he was taking it smooth and easy, and he was kind of happy to be out of pain, or headed that way. And he was
focusing on quality of life.
Yeah. It was not a thing of, you've got to do everything possible. It's like, and you're still going to only live a few other months, and everything possible, from all reports, is pretty painful, and a lot of people are killed by the process rather than being saved. And so we had a great time. Family all got together. My dad was just in there watching, golf games on TV and talking very, honestly about what's happening and what he wants to do. And we all wanted to know, well, do you need us to be staying? We said, no. When you go home, you'll find out when I'm dead. And that's exactly what happened. Is I was headed up to Calaveras County, to the big Calaveras County frog jumps. I was the production manager for the entertainment. And I got up there, and they were all upset because, well, you've got to go home because your dad died. I was like, well, I was expecting it. So, I didn't break down or anything because I'd already done the grieving internally. But a lot of people that I know that have experienced that, just, go berserk and make it even harder on the person that's dying. You see all these people weeping and wailing and doing terrible things to themselves because of what's happening to you. So, God, I hope I don't end up causing any of that when my time comes.
But that's interesting that you mentioned Calaveras County. You know what a calavera is, right?
A calavera? No.
It's a representation of a human skull.
Okay.
And it's a term. So, Dia de los Muertos. One of the traditions is that you honor the deceased using calaveras and Aztec marigold flowers. Um, they call this, I don't know if I can pronounce this correctly, but Simpazushito. And, build home altars and that sort of thing. So Calaveras are actually a part of Dia de los Muertos and relevant to our conversation.
Is that like the candy skulls? Because I used to always,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
I always enjoyed that. Creepy though it may
I'm
appear.
going to eat your skull.
Yeah, but some of them were pretty disgusting. Some people knew how to make the skulls where they were actually edible, and some of them were like, eating candy corn, which is not one of my favorite Halloween candies.
So we're talking about death, but let's talk about Halloween a little bit too. By the time people hear this, Halloween will be just past. But I'm kind of interested. What's your experience of Halloween usually?
Well, these days, it's not having a child in the house anymore. It's quite different, but you know, Clarissa apparently has always been a big fan of Halloween. For the listeners, Clarissa is my wife of 35 years, so I think she's going to stick around. Just judging on that, but yeah, she's always loved it, and so she kind of, when we got married, she kind of rekindled my interest in Halloween. We just enjoyed seeing all the kids showing up in costumes. Clarissa is a great seamstress, and she made all sorts of costumes. My poor grandson, oldest grandson, she made him a squirrel costume, and he looked like a squirrel. I mean, it was realistic, and he was trying to be all hip, and he's set out to trick or treat dressed as a squirrel. But we enjoy it. Just seeing the little kids. When it gets to where it's the 15 and 16-year-olds who are not even wearing a costume, they're just there to score some candy. They're a little creepy, but the little kids are great. I enjoy seeing that.
I guess I can see the connection with the dead or death is uh, in the observance of All Hallowtide, which is an important part of Halloween, or All Hallows Eve, or All Halloween, which became Halloween, All Hallows Evening. But this All Hallowtide was the time during the year that for remembering the dead, especially saints, which are also referred to as hallows, martyrs, and the departed. So this whole thing has grown up around you remember the dead, and you think about death in the terms of, like, we have representations of skeletons. I guess pretty similar to Dia de los Muertos. I said that
Yeah.
I didn't feel Halloween was as connected with death earlier, but I'm seeing now that it is.
Yeah, it's interesting that a lot of our holidays are all were originally pagan events, pagan ceremonies, pagan holidays. Christmas, that was there's a lot of early pagan tradition that was taken in by the Christian churches and
Yeah, the pagans knew how to party.
yeah, cleaned up and rebranded. But Halloween, same way. It's a bunch of pagans, and moms and dads and churches decide, well, we can't honor all these pagans, but we'll change it around and make it spooky, candy grabbing.
Well, there's a connection with Sawin, which is spelled Samhain. It's a Gaelic festival. End of harvest, end of harvest, beginning of winter, and the darker half of the year. So it's like a kind of a festival built around that. And it it's thought to have origins in Celtic pagan um, cultures. and um, it was something that you would find in like Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
There were mentions of it in early Irish literature, and it was just kind of passed on. There wasn't a lot of info about it until modern era. They kind of started observing it and kind of seeing what it was about. But it was it was aligned with this sense of Halloween at this time of the year.
Mm-hmm. Well, uh, the Irish and my mom's people, the Choctaw, are very closely tied. You'll find a lot of Choctaw families with Irish names, like Sweeney, for instance. And
Huh.
there is a tradition. Uh, I'm trying to remember which. There was a Choctaw settlement in Oklahoma that heard about the potato famine, and they actually gathered what little money they had, and these were not rich people. These were struggling Choctaw farmers because they were an agrarian culture just like the Irish. They heard about it, and they sent this money, I think it was maybe the equivalent of like $100, to this community in Ireland, and the people were so impressed that they have basically become. It's like the sister city thing, only it's just the sister cultures between the Irish and the Choctaw, because they were impressed by the fact that these poor Choctaw farmers sent them money during the potato famine, and that.
So how did the Choctaw find out that this was happening?
They read it in the newspaper.
They just read the newspaper, yeah.
The Choctaw are not the fearsome Indians of the desert. These these people were they were an agrarian culture. They were some of the best farmers, had the most successful farming communities before they were ripped out of Mississippi and the East Coast and sent to Oklahoma. And in Oklahoma, you see a lot of farming. So they just took what they were tasked with, which was a really nasty bunch of property that shouldn't have been farmable, but they turned them into successful farms because they'd done it before in Mississippi. And reading the history, which I've been doing a lot of lately, it made me understand why my grandmother and all of her family were so different from a lot of the other people I met in Oklahoma. The people that were the settlers, had a whole different tradition as opposed to the Choctaw families in Durant, where they all lived. And
was it the Choctaw that recently got Oklahoma back?
no, that was it was one of the other nations. I wanted to say maybe the Creek, which were actually the mortal enemies of the mortal enema of the Choctaw, mortal enemies. But they're all friends now because they're all civilized folk. But I can't remember which nation it was, but it basically applied to about half of Oklahoma. They didn't follow the procedure for screwing over the Indians. So the courts held for the Indians, saying, oh, okay. And think about saying Indian. I'll say it, and I've had people correct me, say, you should be saying Native American. I said, even the Native Americans call us Indians. My grandmother said Indian. She went to Indian girls' school. So it's like semantics.
How about indigenous Americans?
I mean, tomato, potato, potato, Indian, Schmindian. I mean, they're people. And what you call them is a personal thing. I'm interchangeable with Native American or indigenous or Indian.
Or wild Indian?
Uh, I, I think I qualify in that category at times.
There's just that confusion of, I mean, there is India and there are Indians in India. And my recollection is that when Europeans first landed in the USA in America, they
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 thought
thought
they were
that
in
they were
India.
encountering people from India. They thought they had landed in India, and that's how they started calling them Indians.
But
Is that really true?
from what I've read in history, yeah, they thought they would, they were going to India to get those nice spices, get a good curry. When they found out the Native American folk didn't have a good curry, then they realized they didn't really discover India, but.
They were just looking for a decent Indian restaurant.
Exactly. But, Choctaw food is okay. It's not as spicy, perhaps. Anyway, we were talking about death, and
I know we were talking about death,
and I drove us
drifted
over.
the way we always do.
Drifting is our nature. But
Maybe we just ran out of useful things to say about death. There's actually a lot to say about it, though.
yeah, and everyone has a different approach. So ask anyone, to talk about death, and you'll get a different story just about every time, because everyone is accommodated, an uncomfortable subject for a lot of people.
It's hard to think about non-being. It's hard to even envision it. I mean, we're so attached to our being and our persistent experience of being and being alive, that the idea that we would just be gone. I mean, what can you do with that? Though, if you kind of think back to before you were born, it would be kind of like that, I guess. And on the other hand, if you started thinking in terms of living infinitely, infinity is a little hard to envision as well. Even though I know we have the infinity symbol as our logo, but infinity is it's a difficult concept. Either way you think about it, it's difficult. And it's all part of a big mystery because we don't really know. We have no idea what the death experience will be like. Well, we know what a near-death experience is like. But over time, it could be that, it could be that a near-death experience is just the last bit of consciousness before the brain dies completely.
Well,
what's after that?
I actually attended a wake for a departed friend, and the wake was held by a bunch of Satanists in Oakland. And they had a satanic wake, and it wasn't all that different from all the Christian wakes that I had been to. I think people just needed to do something, but I knew these people were. I thought, this is going to be weird. They're going to have, devil costumes. I was like, no, they were all just
hanging out.
Right? Had a bunch of food, a bunch of drink, and a bunch of weed. People were just, wandering around and talking about the departed friend. And then you look on the walls, and there's all their... They were big fans of some of the satanic rock groups, so there were posters of that. And
there were satanic rock groups? Oh, my God.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the name.
Black Sabbath?
No. They didn't like Black Sabbath at all. It was some punk band and was related to various satanic wannabes, I guess. I don't know. I didn't spend a lot of time there. It's like it was creepy enough when they started talking about, well, you need to come to our black mass. It's like, no, I don't think so, Skippy. See ya.
They tend to be metal bands, don't they? The satanic bands.
Yeah, metal, heavy punk, death metal. Yeah, there's a lot of that.
Coven, Satan, Dark Funeral, Morbid Angel,
Ah, there you go.
Morduk.
There's another one that its initials, D something or other, that was one of the big. This was back in the '80s. Who knows? But the whole point of my babble is that people are grasping at some way to deal with an uncomfortable subject. And it's interesting that a lot of times they just co-opt with somebody else. Somebody probably went from to a Christian wake that was part of the Satanist movement and said, well, that was a lot of fun. We should do that at our next wake. And next thing you know, they're all looking alike instead of being so different.
I mean, it's all just kind of trying to deal with that mystery, right?
Yeah.
And I said earlier, it's hard to envision non-being. Really, I don't think anybody believes they're going to die.
Well, I think
you might say that
people
you
hope
it,
they
you
won't.
might think that you accept it, but I think everybody sort of holds out some hope that there's going to be some persistence of something.
Well, the problem is we don't get an operating manual like you do with good software or hardware. I mean, you don't get, at birth they don't say, okay, kid, here's your manual for how to live and die. It's like, well, okay. It would be nice if they had one, but it would be also pretty much impossible to have it apply to every culture. So that's the problem with dealing with life and death is the life part's pretty easy to nail down because there's a lot of people that have lived and written about it, but you don't get a lot of books from beyond the grave, at least not ones that are for real. So there's no operating manual on what you do when you die.
You will be singing hymns in heaven.
Yes. And
I had this experience of reading a book by Billy Graham when I was a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
And he started talking about what heaven was going to be like, and it just terrified me. I couldn't imagine myself. He said everybody would be singing hymns, and I don't know.
The
way
hellfire
that he described it, it didn't sound like it would really be that much fun or very interesting,
Yeah, what was the Talking Heads lyric? Heaven is a place where nothing ever happens.
Yeah, there you go.
That just terrifies the shit out of me. Nothing ever happens. Why am I hanging out
nothing
here?
ever happens over here.
Yeah.
I'm in heaven.
One of my favorite Townes Van Zandt songs is "Heavenly Houseboat Blues," singing about showing up in heaven and there was no guitar and there were no houseboats, and she's like, "No, I think I'll pass."
What I think the afterlife is probably going to be like, if there is one, I kind of follow Beetlejuice. It's going to be like an institution, right? It's going to be a bureaucracy, and you're going to have to be processed when you die. And there's going to be a desk and a chair at the gates of heaven, and somebody's going to be sitting there, and they're going to want to see your paperwork.
Yeah, and you've got to take a test to pass. Yeah, it's like the friggin' SATs all over again. Yeah, it was a hell getting into college, and now I'm going to have to pass a test to get into heaven, and I didn't study at all.
And then what would hell be?
I think we're there.
Yeah, exactly.
You look around, I see a lot of devils, especially in Florida. I mean, maybe Florida is hell. I don't know.
Well, hell is like a persistent experience of fear, right? And there's certainly enough fear to go around right now. People are so fearful, and they're so anxious, and there's so much, especially fear of the other.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose that's a hell of a sort.
Yeah, it's just interesting to see how people who are supposedly religious are indulging in things that used to be considered the work of the devil, and now they're taking it as part of, well, to be a good Christian, you got to go out and beat up some Asians. It's like, no, I don't believe they wrote about that in the Bible, but you see a lot of that going on, and just people have a different idea of good and evil. I guess are in the eye of the beholder. There.
I know there was I've encountered some people who felt that because they were Christians and inherently saved, they had accepted Christ and so forth, so that they could do whatever the hell they wanted to do.
Yeah, and did you say a quick prayer?
That's not common, but I've run into it before.
Well, I've heard people say, all I've got to do is make sure I say I'm sorry in a prayer just as I'm dying, right after the car wreck. It's like, well, so you had a crummy life. You're really nasty to everyone you knew, but you went to heaven because you spouted out a quick prayer as the car was going over the cliff. Somehow that doesn't register with me as a logical method of getting to heaven.
It could be that hell is really more about sort of what you experience here and what you experience at the point of death, whether you can truly let go. There was I was reading something about the question of a good death. And, people will have their idea what a good death would be. Like you die in your sleep, or you die peacefully, you get to say goodbye to everybody, that sort of thing. And a bad death would be like a violent death or a sudden and unexpected death. A death like, you and I had a mutual friend who died and there wasn't anybody there. He was alone and wasn't discovered for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows what his death was like, because nobody was there to even be aware that he had died.
I've had a number of people say that their idea of a great death would be to die in the middle of sex. You have an orgasm and die. It's like, okay. kind of.
Well, they do call that the little death, don't they?
Well, if it's.
I'm going to research that.
Okay, the little death.
No, I'm pretty sure that Le Petit Mort, okay, brief loss or weakening of consciousness, and in modern usage refers specifically to the sensation of post-orgasm as likened to death.
Either I don't know how to die or I don't know how to have an orgasm. Somehow that doesn't register.
I'm trying to see Petit Mort defined as a state or event resembling or prefiguring death. I don't know. There's some sense of being post-orgasm being like death. I kind of don't make that connection.
Well. Yes. Whoever came up with that must have had a really bad orgasm. It's like, oh God, it's painful. It's like, no, you did it wrong. You need to go try again.
I'm studying it. I'm researching it. Post-orgasmic state of unconsciousness that some people have after having some sexual experiences. So if your sex knocks you out, I guess.
Okay.
I don't think I have experienced that.
Well, I've gone unconscious, but it was usually because I had also been drinking or something. So.
Wow, there's also something called a sexual headache. It's a headache that occurs in the skull and neck during sexual activity.
No, I missed out on that one.
Did you know about that?
No, that wasn't in the operating manual that I had.
And there's something called post-orgasmic illness syndrome, in which people have chronic physical and cognitive symptoms immediately following ejaculation in the absence of a local genital reaction. The symptoms can last for up to a week.
Good Lord.
I'm learning some stuff here, and this is all from talking about death. Next thing you know, we're talking about the little death.
You're scaring me now. It's like, I'm going to have an orgasm and be sick for a week. It's like, no, I don't want that.
Well, the obvious solution is just don't have an orgasm.
Whoop. Anyway. I think we
Next.
Anyway, moving
have
on.
We done this subject to death?
I think we killed it.
Well, we haven't quite done an hour, but when you're done, you're done.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, a lot of our podcasts, we could probably stop 15 minutes early and be doing a good thing. I've been told.
Or we could even stop after 15 minutes and be doing a good thing.
And depending on the speaker, because I've been told I should have stopped talking 2 minutes ago. And I go, well, what did I say 2 minutes ago? Anyway.
Well, our huge audience of listeners must be fascinated with our voices.
Well,
that's all I can imagine.
It would be nice to get some input. Yeah, if you're listening to this and it spurred you to comment about it, let us know the comment. We'd like to hear what other people feel about death and dying and all the practices that revolve around that. So
yeah, and in fact, Plutopia should be more interactive than it is.
We allow commenting. We didn't block it out.
You can send us comments on our Facebook page, or there's also a Facebook group that you can ask to join, and you can tweet at us.
We're not proud. We'll listen to anyone.
We are at Plutopia on Twitter, and we would love to get feedback from people. We don't really ask for it often enough. In fact, we haven't asked for it before, but here we are.
Feed us, Seymour. Feed me, Seymour. No, that's
Feed me.
That's a different movie. Anyway, Seymour, I think our deed here is done.
Yeah, I think it's time to trick or treat.
Yep. I'm going to go get that candy that I bought that I kind of claim is for the kids, but it's really for us to eat.
There you go.
Screw the kids.
Anyway, all right, off we go.
Thank you, John. You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lubkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.